Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're sinking our teeth into a topic that's both spooky and scientific.
Vampires.
You heard right. And before you say, oh, come on, those are just stories, hear me out. We're taking a deep dive into an excerpt from What Dracula Didn't Want You to Know, the science behind vampirism.
Fascinating.
It is. Get this. You might be surprised by what real-life medical conditions can actually explain about those creepy creatures of the night.
Well, vampire myths have been around forever, haven't they? Different cultures, different spins on these legendary beings.
Right. But the modern vampire, like the one that really gives you the chills, owes a lot to, well, one vampire in particular.
Dracula.
Dracula, the OG vampire.
Yeah.
Our source describes him as tall, imposing with piercing eyes, thin nose, and get this, peculiarly sharp white teeth.
Sounds about right. Those teeth, they kind of stick out over his lip.
Yeah, creaky, right? But here's the thing.
What's that?
Stoker, the guy who wrote Dracula, he didn't just make this stuff up. He was inspired by real events.
Oh, really? Like what's...
Well, think back to the 18th century in Europe. They had these things called vampire outbreaks.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about those. People were terrified. They actually dug up bodies and did all these rituals to stop the supposed vampires.
They dug up graves. Seriously. That's intense.
It was, but here's the fascinating part. All that fear and frenzy, it led to some serious scientific investigations.
So they actually tried to study vampires.
Well, kinda. You see, doctors and pathologists back then wanted answers, right? And all their work, well, it really laid the groundwork for how we try to understand this whole idea of vampirism through science today.
Okay, so are you saying vampires are real? Like, are they actually out there?
Yeah, okay, maybe not lurking in castles and sporting capes, but what we're looking at today is if some of those classic vampire traits, like really stem from a real medical condition, it's called Gunther's disease.
Wait, Gunther's disease?
Yeah, some people even call it the vampire disease.
Vampire disease. Okay, now we're talking. Tell me more. What exactly is Gunther's disease, and how does it connect to, all those spooky vampire myths we love?
Gunther's disease, also known as porphyria, is a genetic condition. It basically messes with your body's ability to produce heme.
Heme? Is that like a fancy word for blood?
Close. It's a vital part of your red blood cells. Heme carries oxygen throughout your body. Think of it like the delivery truck for oxygen in your blood.
Okay, got it.
Now, with Gunther's disease, those delivery trucks break down. It leads to a buildup of porphyrins. Those are molecules involved in making heme. And that buildup, well, it causes all sorts of problems. And guess what? They eerily resemble those classic vampire traits.
Wait a minute. So you're telling me some of the things we think of as supernatural, vampire powers, those are actually symptoms of a real disease?
Bingo. Take sunlight sensitivity, for example. Vampires bursting into flames in the sun, right?
Like, it's their kryptonite. But obviously no one's actually bursting into flames, right?
Right. But here's the thing. With Gunther's disease, those porphyrins under the skin, they react really badly to sunlight. So you get these painful blisters and lesions. It's not fire, but...
I bet it feels like it.
Exactly.
Okay, that's creepy. But it kind of makes sense. What about, like, the other classic traits? Being pale, having red eyes, that whole undead look?
Gunther's disease can explain those, too. It causes anemia, which means you don't have enough healthy red blood cells.
Oh, so that's why they're so pale.
Exactly. Their blood literally isn't as red, and all that porphyrin buildup, it can also make your eyes all bloodshot.
So there you have it. Pale skin, red eyes, looking a bit like you just crawled out of a coffin. All thanks to a real medical condition.
It's pretty wild, isn't it?
Whoa. So you're saying vampires could have just been people with, like, a blood disorder this whole time?
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? But there's more. What about the whole garlic thing? Vampires being repelled by garlic?
Oh, yeah. That's a classic. But wait, are you saying there's a science?
Even the garlic. Remember that compound allicin I mentioned? Well, it turns out allicin can actually make the symptoms of Gunther's disease way worse.
Hold up. Seriously. Garlic, the stuff that gives you dragon breath, can actually mess with this disease.
Yep, that's the one. Allicin disrupts heme production even further. So you can imagine, for someone with Gunther's disease, eating garlic.
Probably not a good idea.
Not a good idea at all.
So maybe vampires weren't actually afraid of garlic. Maybe they just had a really, really bad reaction to it.
Exactly.
That is so cool. But, there's one big question that everyone's probably thinking about right now. The thirst for blood. That's like the most iconic vampire trait. Can science really explain that one too?
Ah, yes, the blood drinking. It's like the vampire's calling card, right? And guess what? There are some intriguing connections to Gunther's disease here, too.
Oh, I knew it. I was waiting for this one. So
Yeah.
tell me, how could a real medical condition make someone, crave blood?
Okay, so there are two main pieces to this puzzle. We've got severe iron deficiency, and then there's something called pica.
Pica? Is that like a pizza topping or something?
Not quite. Pica is a recognized eating disorder, and basically, people with pica, they have this intense urge to eat things that aren't actually food.
Things that aren't food. Like
I'm
what?
talking dirt, clay, even things like paint chips. And yeah, sometimes blood.
Wait, hold on. You mean people actually crave blood?
Yeah.
Like that's a real thing. It's not just, a vampire legend.
It's a real thing. In fact, it's even listed in the DSMV, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So this blood craving, it's a legitimate medical condition. So now, imagine someone with Gunther's disease. They're already dealing with severe iron deficiency because of their anemia. Their body is like screaming for iron.
Right.
And then on top of that, they have pica. It's not that far-fetched to think that they might develop a craving for blood.
Wow, this is really starting to make sense.
Mm.
So are you saying that what we think of as vampires, these blood-sucking creatures of the night, could have actually been people with porphyria, anemic, and with pica, who were just desperately trying to get iron from any source they could?
Exactly. It's a far cry from the romanticized vampires we see in movies, but it's a pretty fascinating look into how a real medical condition might have fueled those supernatural myths.
This whole deep dive is blowing my mind. It's incredible to think that a rare genetic condition could explain so much about these creatures we thought were pure fantasy.
It really is. It kind of shows you the power of observation and how people interpret things they don't understand. Centuries ago, they didn't have the scientific knowledge to understand why some people had these symptoms, so they created stories.
They created stories to explain the unexplainable.
Right, and those stories were passed down through generations, getting a little more elaborate with each telling. And eventually, they transformed into the vampire myths we know and love today.
So are you saying that vampires don't actually exist? Because honestly, I'm kind of bummed about that.
Well, I can't say for certain that we'll ever find a real-life Dracula hanging out in a Transylvanian castle, but a lot of those classic vampire traits, they've got totally plausible explanations rooted in real medical conditions.
That's still pretty cool. So we might not have immortal bloodsuckers, but we do have this really interesting genetic disorder that can explain a lot of the myths. It makes you wonder how many other mythical creatures might have real-world explanations too.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. But there's something I keep coming back to. Even though we can explain some of these so-called vampire traits with science, these myths, they still capture our imagination. Why do you think that is?
Yeah.
What is it about vampires that still has this hold on us?
That's a great question, and I think it really speaks to that deep-seated fascination we humans have with the unknown. We've always been drawn to stories about the supernatural, the mysterious, the things that go bump in the night.
I don't know about you, but this whole deep dive, it's really got me thinking.
Me too. It's amazing how a medical condition like Gunther's disease can shed light on these ancient myths.
It's kind of funny. We can explain those vampire traits with science, but those myths, they still have this power, don't they?
I agree. It's like we can appreciate both the scientific explanation and the mystery, the myth itself.
Exactly. This whole deep dive, it's really been eye-opening.
It has. And, for anyone listening who's intrigued, there's so much more to explore. Gunther's disease, the history of vampire myths, how science and folklore come together. It's all out there.
So listeners, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the science behind vampires, keep that curiosity burning. There's a whole world of fascinating stuff waiting to be discovered.
And remember, folks, there's always something new to learn. Keep asking questions, stay curious, and you never know what mysteries you might unravel.
Until next time, deep divers,
Yeah.
stay curious. And hey, maybe keep a clove of garlic handy, just in case.